The candles in the long gallery at Marlow Park had been lit for 2 hours before Daniela arrived, and by the time she crossed the threshold into the winter assembly, the warmth of 300 flames had turned the air close and golden. She stood at the edge of the room in her black gown, the wool fine enough to be respectable and plain enough to announce everything her present circumstances had made of her, and she watched the county gather itself into its familiar formations. The bright young women arranged near the musicians like flowers in a particular light, the older matrons in their clusters of satin and pearl, the men in their dark coats moving through the room with the particular confidence of men who have never had occasion to doubt their welcome. She had not wanted to come. Her hostess, Mrs. Eleanor Byfield, had pressed her with the determined cheerfulness of a woman who believed that society was medicine and that 18 months was a sufficient period for grief. Daniela had not argued the point. She had fastened the jet brooch at her throat, smoothed the black wool over her stays, and told herself the evening required only endurance. What she had not anticipated was the voice that found her within the first quarter hour. Lady Cecily Ashcroft stood near the fireplace with the posture of a woman who understood that every room she entered belonged to her. She was 60 years of polished certainty, draped in silver-gray silk, a fan of ivory and painted flowers, held at precisely the height that communicated both composure and authority. She had beside her a young woman of perhaps 20 years, fair-haired and luminous in white muslin trimmed with gold ribbon, whose very brightness seemed designed as a counterpoint to Daniela's black. That young woman was Miss Portia Vane, and the look she cast across the room contained no malice and required none, being the untroubled assessment of someone who had never seriously been required to compete. Lady Cecily's voice did not carry beyond the immediate circle, which was a form of precision rather than restraint. "The widow Hartwell," she said to the woman at her elbow, "still in mourning after 18 months. One begins to wonder whether the black is grief or calculation." The woman at Lady Cecily's elbow murmured something in return. "Quite so," Lady Cecily said. "A woman with no estate, no income, and no prospects wears her sorrow very publicly, I have always found." Daniela heard none of this directly. She heard the shape of it, the way a person hears weather moving through a house before any door has opened. In the slight adjustment of attention around her, the small recalibration of how the room held itself when she moved through it. She was 24 years old and had learned, in the 18 months since Captain Hartwell's death, to read a room the way she had once read the weather over her father's fields in Wiltshire, watching for the signs that preceded the storm rather than waiting for the rain. She had come from those fields to this life. And then the fields had been taken by the entail when her father, Sir Hugh Hartwell, died 3 years ago, and the life had shifted beneath her feet, the way ground shifts in a flood. The estate had passed to a distant cousin whom she had met twice and disliked on both occasions, and she had gone to Captain Hartwell's household in Bath instead. And then Captain Hartwell had died at Salamanca 18 months past, and the household in Bath had dissolved in the particular quiet way that things dissolve when there is not enough money left to argue about. What remained was the jet brooch, a trunk of clothing, a small income that required careful management, and the company of Mrs. Byfield, who had been her mother's friend, and who believed in society as medicine. This was what the mourning dress concealed, and the room could not see. Not strategy, not calculation, but the ordinary debris of a life that had been quietly emptied of everything it was meant to contain. She took a glass of negus from a passing footman, held it without drinking, and turned her attention to the room. The Earl of Marlow stood at the far end of the gallery. She registered him the way one registers a feature in a landscape that does not move when everything else does. As a fixed point, a stillness against the room's busy warmth. He was 31 years old, which she would learn later. and had the kind of face that is called cold by people who have never seen it in the moment when it fails to hold its discipline. He was tall, dark-coated, his cravat immaculate, and his expression arranged into the same quality of formal distance that the room extended toward him as a courtesy. 3 different women had smiled at him since she had begun watching. He had acknowledged each smile with a correctness so precise it communicated nothing at all. He was speaking with a man she did not recognize, a spare, careful figure in a brown coat who kept his hands behind his back, and she thought for a moment that his attention remained entirely on that conversation. Then she understood it did not. He was looking at her. Not with the frank appraisal she had grown accustomed to, the kind that measured her dress and her face, and her absence of diamonds, and returned a verdict in 3 seconds. He was looking with something that had no practical name, a quality of attention that was longer than courtesy required, and stiller than assessment would produce. When she met his gaze, it did not move. He did not look away. Then Mrs. Byfield appeared at her elbow with a plate of biscuits and a cheerful determination to introduce her to the vicar's wife. And by the time Daniela looked back, the Earl of Marlow had turned again to the man in the brown coat. She told herself this meant nothing. She was very practiced at this particular form of telling herself. If you are finding yourself settled into Daniela's world already, you are exactly where the story needs you. Stay with it. The country winter deepened through the fortnight that followed, and the assembly at Marlow Park gave way to the slower social architecture of morning calls and drawing-room afternoons, where the county arranged itself in upholstered chairs and rehearsed its opinions at a comfortable temperature. Daniela accompanied Mrs. Byfield to these gatherings with the same quiet economy she brought to everything, seated where she was placed, speaking when she was asked, attending carefully to the conversations around her while contributing to them only what was necessary. It was at Lady Prescott's drawing-room, on a Tuesday when the frost on the windows made the room feel sealed away from the world, that the label found her a second time. Lady Cecily was holding court near the tea-table, and Portia sat beside her in pale lavender, her embroidery hoop in her lap, her smile available and pleasant and slightly bored. They had been discussing the season's prospects, and the conversation had arrived, with the inevitability of conversations in that particular kind of room, at the subject of suitable attachments. Lord Marlow requires a woman of established family, Lady Cecily said, in the tone of a woman stating a natural law. 20 years of widowhood have taught me that a great estate rewards a specific kind of wife, not novelty, not sentiment. Established family, settled character, and the resources to manage what such a position requires. Her gaze crossed the room to where Daniela sat, with her black wool and her quiet hands. The widow Hartwell is a perfectly respectable woman, Lady Cecily added, with the precision of someone who has learned to wound without leaving a mark. One simply cannot imagine Marlow Park opening its doors to morning dress and a Somerset jointure that barely covers a seamstress's bill. The room did not laugh. The room did something more effective, which was to go very slightly and unanimously quiet, and then resume its conversation at the same pitch as before, with no external sign that anything had been said that required acknowledgement. Daniela's hands in her lap were perfectly still. Her face was composed. She had learned this composure the way one learns to carry water across an uneven floor, through years of practice and the specific education of spilling. She did not look up. She did not give the room the satisfaction of witnessing her receive the blow. What she gave it instead was 3 sentences of perfectly measured conversation with the vicar's wife about the quality of wool at the Marlow market. And then she excused herself to examine the shelves of books near the window, because there was always something honest about a room's books, and because standing with her back to the room was a form of control she was still permitted. She had been standing there for perhaps 4 minutes, her fingers resting on the spine of a cowper she had no intention of reading, when she became aware of a presence at her shoulder. She turned. The Earl of Marlow stood 2 feet from her. She had not heard him cross the room, which was information about how the room had quietly parted for him, as rooms did. "You were discussing the Marlow wool market," he said. It was not a question. "I was," she said. "I grew up near Marlow. My father kept sheep on the south pasture." "Sir Hugh Hartwell?" She was still for a moment. "You knew him." "He came to the park once," Edmund said. 3 years ago. He had papers he wished to discuss with my solicitor. I was not in residence." He said this with the level weight of a man reporting a fact, but his jaw had tightened 1 fraction of a degree when he said it, and his eyes, which were gray and quite steady, did not move from her face. She did not know what to do with this information, which arrived in her chest like a key presented without a lock to fit it. "I was not aware of that visit," she said carefully. "No," he said. "I expect not." He did not elaborate. He moved away before she could frame another question, back into the room's social current, and she stood with the Cowper volume in her hand and the particular sensation of a conversation that had meant something she could not yet read. The tenant difficulty arose the following week, and Daniela was present for it by accident. She had come to Marlow Park at Mrs. Byfield's invitation for a small luncheon, and had arrived earlier than the appointed hour because the road from Byfield House was shorter than she had remembered, and the footman who received her had guided her without comment through the side passage that connected the east garden to the main entrance. She was crossing the kitchen yard when she heard voices from the low wooden door that opened into the estate carpenter's outbuilding. A man's voice, raised with the particular flatness of someone delivering a verdict he has already decided, and a child's voice, very tight with the effort of not crying. She stopped. The child was perhaps 9 years old, a boy in a patched coat who was explaining in a voice of careful desperation that the missing 2 shillings had been left on the carpenter's bench that morning, and that his father had not taken them from the household account. The man was the estate steward, a Mr. Garvey, who was neither cruel nor kind, but possessed of the specific quality of officials who believe their authority requires no examination. He was informing the child that the 2 shillings were absent from the week's accounting, that someone had removed them, and that the boy's father would be dismissed from his tenancy at the end of the month. "The shillings are not absent," Daniela said from the doorway. Both of them turned. Mr. Garvey's expression closed into the practiced blankness of a man deciding how much attention a woman in mourning dress from a neighbor's house deserved. "The matter does not concern you, ma'am," he said. "The shillings," she said, walking in and lifting the corner of the workbench's leather apron with 2 fingers, "are here." The coins were against the far wall, where they had evidently rolled when the apron was thrown down in haste. She placed them on the bench's surface and looked at Mr. Garvey without expression. "The child told you the truth," she said. "His father stays?" Mr. Garvey's chin rose. "That is not within your authority to determine." "No," she agreed. "Bring the matter to Lord Marlow." She did not stay to hear his response. She turned and walked back through the kitchen yard, which was empty and cold, and which smelled of wood smoke and frost. And she was most of the way to the side passage before she understood that she was not alone in the yard. Edmund stood in the doorway of the east garden gate. He had come from the garden side, evidently, and had been there long enough to have heard the carpenter's outbuilding exchange through the open door. His face showed nothing, precisely nothing, in the way that a face shows nothing when it is working very hard at the task. His gray eyes were on her. She looked back at him. "The shillings were behind the leather apron," she said. "I heard," he said. She nodded once and went inside. The boy's father kept his tenancy. She learned this from Mrs. Byfield's kitchen maid 3 days later, delivered as the kind of minor local news that moves through a house's staff before it reaches its inhabitants. Mr. Garvey had revised his accounting. The dismissal had been withdrawn. 2 shillings had been recorded as found. Edmund said nothing to her about it at the luncheon that afternoon, nor at the card party 2 evenings later, nor at the short walk the whole party took through the East Garden on Friday, because the frost had lifted for one afternoon, and Mrs. Byfield was a woman who believed that fresh air and fresh resolutions arrived on the same air. He said nothing about the tenant boy, but he stood near enough to her during the walk to hand her across the frozen patch of ground near the sundial, and he did not release her arm immediately when the ground was level again, and his hand at her elbow was very steady and carried no quality of obligation at all. She told herself, "Do not read this." She was good at this, and getting worse. It was the evening of the Prescott dinner, 2 weeks into December, that changed the temperature of everything. The dinner was 12 at table, and the port had been cleared, and the company had moved to the drawing room, and the fire was high, and the candles were fresh, and the room had the particular ease of a gathering that has eaten and drunk well, and has settled into the comfortable license of late conversation. Daniela was near the bookcase again, which was a habit she could not seem to break, and she was half attending to Mrs. Prescott's account of her niece's difficulties in London when Lady Cecily came to stand at the center of the room. There was a quality to the movement that Daniela noticed with the reflexes of someone who has learned to watch for weather. It was too deliberate, too timed, the movement of a woman who has been waiting for the right silence. "I wonder," Lady Cecily said, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, "whether the assembled company is aware of the document that has come to my attention this week. A letter from the solicitor's office at Taunton regarding the late Sir Hugh Hartwell's estate." The room attended. Rooms always attended when Lady Cecily used that particular register. "It appears," she continued, her fan moving through one slow arc, "that a codicil to Sir Hugh's will was presented to Marlow Park's solicitor some years ago. A codicil that, if legitimate, would establish a specific bequest of personal property to Sir Hugh's daughter, outside the male entail. However," her fan paused, "the solicitor at Taunton has recorded a discrepancy in the document's seal. A discrepancy which suggests the codicil was altered, or perhaps fabricated entirely, by someone with a motive to establish a claim." She looked across the room. Her gaze came to rest on Daniela with the satisfied precision of someone who has placed a pin very exactly where they intended. "A woman in reduced circumstances," Lady Cecily said, "who has spent the better part of the county season cultivating an acquaintance with an earl's household, might find such a document convenient." The room was very quiet. Daniela felt the blood leave her face. She felt it as a specific physical event, the way she had felt the letter from the War Office arrive 18 months ago. A cold descending from the crown of her head to the base of her throat. A stillness in her hands. A clarity that arrived precisely because every alternative to clarity had been removed. She was standing in a room of 12 people, all of them watching her, and the woman who had just accused her of forgery was wearing silver-gray silk and a smile of polished regret. And the crowd, she could feel it, was uncertain enough to wait. Edmund was at the far end of the room. She could not see his face from where she stood. She did not look for it, because she could not afford to look for it. Because she was alone in the center of a room where a well-born woman had just called her a schemer. And the only thing she had left was the discipline of not making it worse by appearing to need saving. She reached into the small reticule she carried at her wrist. Her father had given her the codicil 6 months before he died, pressed into her hand after a journey she had never understood the purpose of, with instructions to keep it close and to show it only when there was no other choice. She had carried it since his death in its original sealed wrapper, the solicitor's notation on the outer fold in ink gone slightly brown with 3 years of proximity to her person. She had shown it to no one. She had told no one it existed. She laid it on the mantelpiece in front of Lady Cecily. "My father's sealed codicil," she said. "Dated, witnessed, and sealed by Mr. Silas Crowe of Crowe and Pembridge, Taunton, in the autumn of 1811. The seal is intact. I have not touched the document since my father gave it to me." She kept her voice level with the same quality of effort she had brought to carrying water across an uneven floor, and she was aware, distantly, that her hands were very steady. "If there is a discrepancy in the Taunton solicitor's records, I cannot speak to it. I can speak to this document, which has never been out of my keeping." Lady Cecily looked at the codicil. Something shifted in her expression. Very briefly. That was not quite calculation, not quite recognition, but lived in the country between them. "One document," she said, "does not establish legitimacy." "No," Daniela agreed. "Lord Marlowe's solicitor may examine it." She picked up the codicil, placed it in her reticule, and walked to the chair near the window, and sat down. Her heart was loud in her throat. She did not show it. 3 days passed with the dense quality of time in which nothing is resolved and everything is suspended. Mrs. Byfield was careful and kind and asked no direct questions, which was its own form of answer. The county sent its silence ahead of itself. Daniela walked in the garden at Byfield House every morning because walking was the only activity that prevented the silence from settling into her chest like an obstruction. And she thought about the codicil in her reticule, and about her father's face when he had pressed it into her hands, and about the fact that whatever came next, she had told the truth. She had not schemed. She had survived. These were different things, and she had known they were different even before the room at the Prescott dinner arranged itself into the particular shape of people waiting to see whether she would be proved correct or correct about nothing. The winter ball at Marlow Park was held on the 17th of December, which was a Saturday, and the county gathered in the long gallery with the same formations she had watched on the night of the assembly 3 weeks prior, except that the temperature of the room was different now, carrying the specific charge of a gathering that knows something has been arranged and does not yet know what. The candles were the same. The musicians were the same. The gallery was the same long room with its high windows and its fires burning at both ends, and its portraits in their frames along the wall. Edmund stood near the door to the east corridor with Mr. Crowe, who was the spare, careful figure in the brown coat that she had seen him speaking with on the first evening. She had since learned his name and his office, and the quality of his attention had the careful precision of a man who deals in documents and dislikes imprecision. They had been in correspondence, she understood, about the codicil. Mr. Crowe had examined it in the 3 days since the Prescott dinner. His examination had taken 2 days, which was either very fast or very slow, depending on what one was hoping he would find. Daniela stood with Mrs. Byfield near the musicians and did not look toward the door to the east corridor, which required a specific quality of effort she was becoming practiced in. Lady Cecily was at the center of the room, Portia beside her in ivory satin, both of them arranged with the composed certainty of a general who believes the terrain favors him. Lady Cecily had spoken to 4 people since the evening began. All 4 of those conversations had lasted slightly longer than social courtesy required. Daniela did not know what was said in them, but she understood their function. When Edmund began to cross the room, she registered it the way she had registered him on the first evening, as a stillness moving toward her, a quality of intention that the room parted for before it had consciously decided to. He moved with the contained directness of a man who has finished deliberating, and the room understood this in its wordless collective way, and turned to watch him. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the precise line of his jaw and the gray of his eyes, which were very steady, and had been, she understood now, very steady in her direction for the better part of 3 weeks. Behind him, across the room, Lady Cecily had gone still. Portia's embroidery hoop, which she had been turning in her hands, was motionless. "Mrs. Hartwell," Edmund said. His voice carried the room without difficulty, which was not its purpose. Its purpose was to reach her. She waited. "Mr. Crow has examined your father's codicil." A pause, 1 heartbeat in length. "The document is legitimate. The seal is original. The bequest stands. The personal estate of Hartwell House, its contents, and the jointure fund attached to it are yours by your father's specific provision, outside the entail." The room was very quiet. 3 years ago," Edmund continued, with the level weight of a man who has thought carefully about each word and is now saying them rather than performing them, "your father came to Marlow Park to register this document with my solicitor. I was not in residence. Mr. Crow has confirmed that the registration was received and properly recorded. The discrepancy Lady Cecily described exists in a different document entirely, a copy made in error by a clerk who has since left the Taunton office, and it pertains to a different estate." He looked at Lady Cecily across the room. Something in the quality of his look, not anger, not triumph, but a steadiness that was more final than either, reached her. Lady Cecily's fan did not move. Her expression, which had been composed through 40 years of social practice, worked briefly at holding itself together, and Daniela saw the moment when it understood that it would not manage the task. "Mrs. Hartwell's mourning dress," Edmund said, and now his voice was quieter, meant for her, "is not a costume. It is the dress of a woman who has survived the last 3 years with more dignity than this room has offered her." He reached into his coat and produced a small object. It was his card, which was the simplest procedural gesture available to a man of his rank in a public room, and it was also not procedural at all. It was the deliberate declaration, visible to every person in the gallery, of an intention that could not be recalled. She took it. Her fingers brushed his in the exchange. He did not step back. "I would be grateful," he said, quietly enough now that the room was required to be silent to hear him. "For the honor of the first dance." She said, "Yes." She said it without trembling and without ceremony, which was how she said every important thing. And she watched his face do what it had been refusing to do for 3 weeks, which was to let her see what was behind it. It was not the crack she had been warned about. The moment when a cold man's control fails and reveals the warmth he has been suppressing. It was something quieter than that. The particular relief of a face that has been holding itself in one position for a very long time, and has been given, at last, permission to be itself. Across the room, Lady Cecily turned. She did not leave. She was too well-bred and too practiced for the immediate departure. She held her place, and her fan moved once through a measured arc, and she said something quiet to Portia, whose expression had moved from pleasant blankness into the honest disorientation of a young woman who has never before been on the wrong side of a public verdict. What Lady Cecily said in that moment was not audible to Daniela, but the contraction in her bearing, the slight inward drawing of the shoulders, spoke clearly enough. This was not a defeat she would acknowledge aloud, but she had registered it, and the registration had weight. Mr. Crow, who had remained near the door to the east corridor throughout, crossed now to Mrs. Byfield's side and spoke to her in a low voice. Mrs. Byfield's hand went to her heart. She looked at Daniela with an expression that was partly relief and partly the vindication of a woman who has held her judgment steady in the face of considerable pressure. The musicians resumed. The room adjusted, the way rooms always adjust when the thing that charged the air has discharged, and the gathering must reconstitute itself as a social occasion. Candles burned. A footman circulated with a tray of champagne. 2 of the women who had been in the circle at the assembly 3 weeks ago made their way, with small adjustments of course and expression, toward Daniela. She acknowledged them with grace rather than triumph, because she was not built for triumph, and had never wanted it. She wanted the truth seen. The truth had been seen. She danced with Edmund. The dance was a country measure with enough movement to make conversation impractical and enough proximity to make it unnecessary. And she was aware of his hand at her waist with the attention one gives to something one has been waiting for, without having allowed oneself to name the waiting. He was precise in the steps, as she had expected, and he did not look away from her face throughout. When the measure ended and the room rearranged itself for the next, he guided her to the side of the gallery and stood beside her in the way of a man who has no intention of being anywhere else. "My father visited you 3 years ago," she said. "He did," Edmund said. "He wanted the codicil registered before the entail was settled. He told Mr. Crow that the document existed and where it was kept, and he asked that its legitimacy be held in evidence in case the bequest was ever disputed." He was quiet for a moment. He trusted the record to speak when it was needed. He was a careful man. Her throat was tight. "He was," she said. "He also told Mrs. Aldred," Edmund said, and there was something in his voice at the name, a careful warmth, "that he hoped his daughter would find her way to the park eventually." She looked at him. "Mrs. Aldred has been at Marlow Park for 30 years, he said. "She remembers the visit. She was the one who admitted your father through the side entrance, because the front drive was being graveled and the carriage could not come through." There was something almost like warmth at the edge of his mouth. It was brief, and it was real, and it mattered more than it had any right to. Mrs. Aldred found her later in the evening, near the fire at the east end of the gallery, a small woman of 70 with a face like polished walnut and eyes that held the specific quality of someone who has watched a household across 3 decades and forgotten very little of what she has seen. "Your father had your look about the eyes," Mrs. Aldred said without preamble. "Steady, a little too careful. I knew when I saw you at the assembly that I had seen those eyes before." Daniela said nothing. The tightness in her throat had become something she was simply managing. "He was a good man," Mrs. Aldred said. "He wanted the right thing done. I am glad to have lived long enough to see it." She pressed Daniela's hand once and returned to her place near the door, where she had been standing. Daniela understood. Since the beginning of the evening. The snow came in the last week before Christmas, arriving first as a fine dust on the east windows, and then settling in earnest across the park's long lawns and the bare lindens in the south garden. Marlow Park received it in the way of a house that has stood through many winters, without remark, without drama, the fires built higher and the curtains drawn against the dark, the household settling into the particular warmth of a house that knows how to be a house. Daniela was in the library on the morning of the 22nd when Edmund found her there, which was not an accident on his part, or a surprise to her. The library was where she had come to think for the past 3 days, and she suspected he had understood this. She was standing near the west wall, where the portraits from the East Gallery's second tier had been moved for rehanging, and she was looking at one that had been recently repositioned, a woman of perhaps 25 in a high-waisted dress of deep green, her hair dark and her expression very still. Her hands folded in her lap in the specific way of a portrait subject who has been asked to be still for a long time and is managing it. She had not known Edmund had been married before. She had learned it the way one learns most things about a careful man, not from him, but from the slow accumulation of evidence. A housekeeper's reference to Mrs. Aldridge's role during a difficult confinement, a drawing room's particular careful avoidance of a subject. An unasked question from Mrs. Byfield that conveyed by its absence what it did not say. Her name was Catherine, Edmund said from the doorway. She did not turn immediately. She looked at the portrait for another moment, and it looked back at her with that expression of careful stillness. "She died 3 years ago," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The child died with her." His voice was level in the way of a man who has said these words many times in private and has learned to say them without breaking, but not without cost. "I was in Edinburgh on estate business. I had calculated that I had another fortnight before she was near her time. The calculation was wrong." She turned to look at him. "I turned the portrait to face the wall 8 months after," he said. "Not from grief alone, though there was plenty of that, but from the particular difficulty of looking at someone you failed." He was very still, looking at Catherine's portrait. "My steward had it rehung this week. He said Mrs. Aldred suggested it. Mrs. Aldred has views on how long things should remain hidden." "She seems to," Daniela said. He looked at her. His face was open in the way it had been at the ball, without its usual careful arrangement. And she saw in it what the cold had been covering all along. Not emptiness, not calculation, but grief that had been carried too long without anyone to share the carrying. "I was told," he said, "that a woman wearing mourning was performing sorrow for social advantage." He said it evenly, without ceremony. "I was not told this by anyone in this house. I was told it by the county's general understanding, which I accepted without examination for approximately 10 days before your conduct with a carpenter's apprentice and 2 shillings made, that understanding impossible to maintain." She held his gaze and said nothing. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your permission?" She considered this for a moment. She had been waiting for 18 months for the cold to lift. And now that it was lifting, she found that she wanted to meet it at its own pace rather than rushing toward it. She was 24 years old and had buried a father and a husband and a house, and she was still standing in this library with her hands at her sides and her heart very loud in her throat. And she thought that she had been correct. These 3 weeks passed, that there was a face behind his face, and that she wanted to know it. "Yes," she said. The codicil lay folded on the library table beside Edmund's own seal, both documents sharing the table's surface in the comfortable proximity of things that belong in the same place. Through the tall west windows, the snow fell steadily across the park's long lawns, soft and persistent, whitening the path to the south garden and the lindens and the sundial where his hand had steadied her a fortnight ago on the frozen ground. The fires in the house were all burning. Mrs. Aldred could be heard in the corridor, directing the repositioning of the portrait frames in the gallery, with the serene authority of a woman who has been waiting a long time to give these particular instructions. Daniela looked at the codicil, and at the new seal beside it, and at the snow at the window. Her father had carried the document to this house 3 years ago, through the back entrance because the drive was being graveled, trusting the record to speak when it was needed. It had spoken. She was here. Marlow Park received the snow the way it received everything. Steadily, without drama, knowing how to be a home. And for the first time in 3 years, so did she. If Daniela's quiet endurance stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Stories about the truth outlasting its suppression find their way here often, and it helps to know which ones have reached you.